Welcome to Command and Control, a podcast series about military command and the control measures used to orchestrate combat engagements and wars. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
Systematic are the creators of Citaware, the world's #1 C4 ISR software. We've designed C2 systems for the military since 1986 and supply more than 45 countries worldwide. With a heritage built on innovative development and rigorous testing, this is a proven in-service solution based on real customer requirement and tailored to fit your needs.
Now, when we started the show, one of the things I wanted to talk about was control in the battle space. The multi-domain operations doctrine, adopted wholeheartedly by most Western states, underwrites a drive for the synchronization of command and control in everything across warfare domains and a little more besides. That synchronization, to me, has some unresolved tensions with the philosophy of mission command, itself the bedrock of Western military operations, education, training, and force design. Now, I wrote a post about that on the website, aureliusthinking.com, that generated some, let's say, heat and light from a variety of people who disputed my thesis that these two things, synchronization and mission command, were not as mutually supportive as the speeches by senior military leaders would have us believe. Now, some of the correspondence was pretty spirited. Indeed, I'm not sure I had quite so much abuse as when we looked at the inadequacies of maneuver doctrine as currently practiced, and that hit new lows in my book. Nonetheless, amongst the really useful comments was a most helpful signposting to MCDP-5, the US Marine Corps Planning Handbook from 1997, signed off by none other than General Charles C. Krulac. Now, that's a name to be spoken with reverence, but I digress. The bit in MCD5 that really grasped my attention was about coupling. I read it a couple of times and thought it was exceptional. I genuinely think that you, dear listener, really need to hear more about this, especially in the context of MDO or MDI, if you're in the UK or Taiwan, because they think about it really differently. So I found someone to explain it to us, and I wondered who to ask about this. But as we said before, if you want to talk about C2, the reality and the theory, talk to a US Marine. Sean Welch is a Marine. He's also the guy who sent me the link to MCDP-5 in the first place. Beside all that, Sean has worked for Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. His military service includes leading Marines and sailors in training and in combat over a couple of decades, building concepts and planning doctrine, teaching, as well as a period on the Hill. Now, Sean's worked a lot with think tanks as well, top-level executives and joint and multinational officers. He's a graduate of the Dwight D. Eisenhower School of National Security and the holder of numerous awards and accolades. The views he expresses here are his personal opinion, and they're his alone. They don't represent the views or position or policy of the US government, the Department of Defense, Department of the Navy, or the US Marine Corps. It's under these caveats that Sean is talking to me today. Sean, listen, welcome to the show. A great pleasure to have you on as a guest. So let's start with coupling. Can you explain it to us, please?
I'm happy to, Peter, and thanks for having me on. Really great insights that you offer habitually in all the ways that you do. The idea of coupling is relatively straightforward in my mind. It initially came to me in my military upbringing through the exposure to MCDP-5 planning, Marine Corps Doctrinal Publication 5. That happened relatively early on in my career. But what we like in our Marine Corps doctrinal publications is they're relatively straightforward and simple to understand. And so in that light, coupling refers to the measure to which actions are dependent upon one another. And so there can be tight coupling, where one action directly affects another, or there can be loose coupling, where there's a relatively distant relationship between the two activities. And so with that, coupling starts to bleed into other MCDPs and the idea, at least in our warfighting philosophies, of the theory and nature of war. And so coupling requires a little bit of context from my view. And another one of our doctrinal publications, Marine Corps Doctrinal Publication 1, Warfighting, we recognize the inherently human nature of war and the human instinct to seek certainty. And we recognize the elusiveness of that certainty in war and the fog, friction, and fluidity in that equation. And so in our quest for certainty, we apply control. And I appreciated your comments at the outset about command and control. And we attempt to centralize risk sometimes. We can also, in doing that, stifle creativity and initiative in that process. So the very human tension between command and control, as we introduce ever more technologies. That relationship, I think, is really at the center of our conversation here as we think about technology and some of the other things. And so I hope that kind of lays out a little bit of the coupling idea and what it represents in terms of tension.
It does. I mean, you pointed me to the coupling explanation in MCDP5, which I think is a brilliant analysis of it. And it links really closely to this idea of synchronization and, of course, to MDO. And it came out way before people were thinking about MDO and even synchronization in the way that people are thinking about it today. And this tension, it feels like synchronization today is more than simple orchestration. And coupling allows you to think about the sort of control measures in a different way. It's about really linking those plans. The key bit for MCDP5 for me was only linking them as much as they need to be. So there wasn't a requirement to couple everything. Indeed, the encouragement in the publication is not to couple things that don't absolutely need to be coupled. You allow them to be separate. You allow the creativity, the initiative to keep running. For mission command, for the initiative, the real driver in that doctrine, to delegate the initiative, to allow the hard charges to push on through and get them through, to allow them the freedom and not synchronize them down under paperwork and all the rest of that stuff, but to allow this loose coupling as it's talked about. And that for me feels much freer than some of the doctrine, some of the publications, some of the talking about, which has come out since 97, particularly probably in the last few years, where MDO is really pushing synchronization to centralize so much of C2 and fires and orchestration and control measures, right? I mean, that's my view. Do you see it very differently?
I don't. I think that tension is really what kind of unsettles many. And the idea that the way that the world is moving technologically and the way that we're attempting to absorb that technology into the military ecosystem, it's happening so fast. And the nature of technology being ostensibly more certain and mathematical and predictable, that gives a sense of comfort. And there's that tension there. But again, that tension, if we allow ourselves to remain weighted towards technology for the sake of technology absorption, I think we stand a real risk of stifling the thing that gives us the most energy, and that is the creativity of the Marines, the creativity of our service members, and the human dimension. And that creativity is what will change the battle space, in my view, most radically, particularly given technology.
Now, you and I think, come from this very particular area, and a lot of the discussions I had after I put something on the website about this unresolved tension between synchronization and mission command was a lot of the dispute came from academics and theorists, right, who have a theoretical, scholarly understanding of the two things. And I get that, right? I really get it. I've worked in think tanks. I understand when you think about things deeply, they look this way in theory. But when you live them, when you breathe them, when you experience them, there's that reality which slightly skews everything you're doing. Do you think there's a difference when we're talking about synchronization, when we're talking about orchestration, when we're talking about mission command and coupling? For you, is there also that difference in theory and reality?
I think it's a great distinction. The difference between theory and application is in front of our face every day. I think in the Marine Corps, we would talk about top-down planning and bottom-up refinement. The bottom-up refinement comes from reality. And so if we were to use a model of a pulsed operation, if you will, it may brief well to talk about synchronization. It may brief well to talk about how we're going to lay technology in. It may brief well to talk about how the character of war changes, and we're going to talk about new dimensions and MDO and so forth. In the past, our application of that has been sort of a land, air, sea type of application. And that's the practitioner's model and experience at this point. But then when we open up the conversation to things like land or space, cyber, and other dimensions or domains, we don't have that same measure of practitioners' experience to rely upon. And so the learning's happening in real time. And the tools that may be available at higher echelons of command aren't necessarily available or haven't been absorbed as deeply into an organization to where the lower echelons of command have the ability to leverage them. And so there's just some divergence there, a disconnect, if you will, between the theory and the practice and the way things have moved in real time.
Now, you dropped in there right at the start of the last intervention. You dropped in there pulsed operations. Now, some of our listeners across Europe and maybe in the Indo-Pacific might not be familiar with that. Can you just give us a quick couple of seconds on pulsed operations and what it means?
I think a simple way that's maybe a little bit more understood is I mentioned air and land. In landward warfare, we have a conversation about sort of aviation overhead while we're inserting reconnaissance or surveillance teams, or when we're conducting a combat logistics patrol, where there's a sense of a combined arms application to this. So, a combat logistics patrol would have rotary wing air overhead that could be providing eyes for a platoon commander or a company commander or what have you that's moving along. There's some dimensions to that. But then when you open the aperture and you start to expand on the idea of a pulse, that may be a pulse in a previous sense. But as we get more sophisticated and the terrain changes, the area of the world we're operating in changes, and we start applying a similar approach to naval warfare, and you add in space and cyber and our dependencies upon it, the idea that we're going to operate in multiple dimensions simultaneously to achieve an effect and do that over time starts to become really new, foreign, and the practice and the theory start to become a little bit less clear in terms of the interrelationships. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. And it sort of links this idea, as you said, the character of war is changing. We've got these domains. So I can see the drivers for something like NDO, for something like the requirement to understand what's happening across the domains, to probably understand it centrally so you can allocate scarce resources and technology, which gives you the opportunity to do that, right? There's this drive towards it. But it feels to me like technology has almost become the raison d'etre in itself. We therefore have the ability to put in all this information into a central space. The individual combat commander on the ground, at sea, wherever, doesn't have the mental capacity to handle all this information because they're engaged in the fight they've got. Therefore, it must happen at a higher headquarters. We're therefore investing more and more of the not just situational awareness, the technology, the systems, all into that headquarters, investing in them rather than the individual at the edge. And technology is compounding that and is driving decisions away from the edge in many ways. And that feels like it's increasingly been driven by a discussion about technology rather than a discussion about how we wanted to integrate the domains together where necessary, like we did for air, land, or air, sea, right? But, back in the day.
Yeah, there's so much packed into that, Peter. I think one thing, if I could just pull on it a little bit, is this idea of speed and decision making. The proliferation of information, the amount of data that's out there in different domains, in a lot of ways can be paralyzing. And the introduction of technology may help us sort through that in sort of an attempt to remove some fog and friction, but also the capability to do that may only reside at a very, very high echelon of command. And so there's this search for decision advantage or speed in decision making that may be enabled by technology. But again, it does cause us to shift our weight towards a higher headquarters level perspective and perhaps away from the lower echelons of command where the actual human level decision making and creativity may be a little bit more pronounced.
And technology also promises this idea of certainty being delivered to higher commanders as well, doesn't it? I mean, there's this idea that if you have more and more information, you don't have to think and assume and make presumptions about stuff. You can actually wait to know because technology will provide you the answers. I mean, this is one of the things that lots of technologists are promising through quantum and AI and precision, position, navigation, timing, all that stuff feels like it's driving decisions up the tree rather than delegating them down them.
I see it similar, Peter. And, when we start to unravel that, the idea that we can be safe in the technology, I think is real dubious assumption. And I don't think everybody believes that, but there's a robust debate and discussion happening around bias and things that are baked into technology and algorithms and so forth. And I think that's a healthy discussion. I do think that Where the information comes from and who is feeding the information space is a strong component of sort of what decisions can be made and what those algorithms are reading and how they start to inform, but dare I say, pollute the minds of commanders that become overly reliant on the thing that the machine spits out as options. That just brings us back to the creativity of the commander, right? And independent thought and the ability at any echelon for commanders to have their own mind and build things and take activities or take actions based off of their judgment. And that drives us back to, I think, things that haven't changed. I think there are some things in war that haven't changed. And I think the MCDP, Marine Corps Doctrinal Publication piece, the historical roots of that gives me some satisfaction that not all that is under our feet is shifting sand. There are some certainties out there, and I think they're a little bit more in a higher level, maybe more theoretical, but they just need application. The technology is not going to solve our problems for us because of our dependencies. And so that's kind of a mud hole I think I just created. But inside of that discussion there, I think there's a rich consideration of the idea of decision advantage and the speed of decision making and the veracity of that decision making, as long as we recognize that the data can be polluted, inaccurate, and biased. We just go back to our judgment as commanders and as operators.
So I'm just furiously scribbling here because, again, from you, there's a lot to pull out of that. But for me, I worry that you said in your answer there that you think there's a robust discussion about information, the balance and biases and heuristics and presumptions. I think from what I've heard, there is a discussion about volume and velocity. I'm not sure there is one about the veracity of information, about people understanding where it comes from, which also links to this idea of decision making at the speed of relevance. People are talking about speed so much as if the only speed of relevance is one for the higher commander that he can give to a politician at the time at which a politician needs to take it. For me, there's a lot more about the speed of relevance, if we're going to use that phrase, at the lower levels, right? I think when it was originally coined, this was about the high tactical, lower tactical level making decisions at the relevance for the fighting edge, not about for the politician, about whether they could apply sanctions in time and stuff. I just think that slightly got skewed. But all that relates directly to what you said at the end there, which is not that technology doesn't have anything to offer. Of course it does. But it's how we have these drivers for change in command and control, specifically the combat experience, right? The old way of evolving thinking about command and control, which is what commanders lived through at low levels of command, they saw reflected and tried to change it to reflect those things. We've got generations of people with experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, the global war on terror, senior commanders who experienced right at the start of their career some of the Cold War thinking. I mean, we had this huge set of experiences in warfare, which are hugely dissimilar, but from which you'd think that commanders could generate a set of principles and ideas that would deliver to the next generation of warfighters something really useful. What do you think about the drives for change in command and control?
The drivers of change, I think, are always going to just continue to evolve, right? And so if we understand the nature and the intent of command and control, I think we can apply that, right? And that brings us back to the previous point about theory versus reality, right? And so there are some things, some handrails, if you will, that we can hold on to as the dynamics and the technology continue to change. I think that the idea of initiative and response is useful. I think what we try and achieve, at least in war, is we try and seize initiative, exploit opportunities, and we rely on those that are closest to the problem to identify that and to act on that, even oftentimes without explicit higher headquarters direction or command. And we think about things like commander's intent. We think about things that others may refer to as mission command. The idea that subordinate elements, folks a little bit more removed from the exquisite technology, are simply going to wait to be told what to do, I think is counter to what we try to achieve in war. And going back to the idea of initiative and response, and we want our commanders to seize the initiative, I think opening the aperture and less tightly synchronizing and coupling activities and more risk tolerance on the part of commanders at any echelon I think is an important tension. And I think may fly in the face of the idea of technology and synchronization and so forth.
There's a part to me that feels like that MDO is not helping the advance of these drivers, partly because it's pushing hard on synchronization as a requirement of CJAD C2 coming in to pull, centralize all this stuff coming together in one battle net and make it available. But it also, to me, fixes things. And in particular, it fixes C2 structures and decision making in a way that I'm not convinced is entirely helpful. This is one of my chief bugbears about MDO. The theory behind MDO is that everything within it is infinitely flexible. The practice of MDO, as you see it on exercises, you see it certainly on this side of the pond within NATO, is it's not being exercised as a flexibility. So once the div commander, the echelon commander decides they will retain certain permissions, those things aren't re-examined. They're held in that entirety for a hugely long period of time. And when I then look at the experiences of the Ukrainians, of the Russians, of the Syrians, of the Israelis, in Yemen, of the Houthis, they don't exercise it in such a fixed fashion. They're far more fluid in how they think and how they delegate, how they change structures. All our thinking about MDO, when I say sort of Western thing about MDO, seems to be about task organizing and then leaving it there. Not task organizing, then breaking apart, then coming together again. It talks a fluid game, but it tends to be much more fixated. And I feel that's the same way that C2 is being approached within MDO. I find that distinctly worrying. Do you think it's different?
I can see that, Peter. And if we sort through that a little bit, I think some of my previous comments remain. The idea for me that we can synchronize such a broad array of activities in so many different domains simultaneously is rich. The technology may enable a measure of that or an increase in that direction, but overstating that and driving towards a world where the world is that clear and that synchronized, I think is not a healthy idea. And so your point about Ukraine and your point about Azerbaijan, we saw that in Nagorno-Karabakh war. I think there's a lot there that shows us that their application in reality isn't consistent completely with our theory of how we're going to integrate these things. So I think we need to be careful about how far in one direction or another we go. Because I go back to the humans that are actually waging the war. That's where things are going to come apart. And the idea that we can control activities and actions in time and space across such a broad frontage in multiple domains, to me, that doesn't seem like something that's achievable, at least in the near term. We can drive towards it, we can use it as a goal, but I don't think that that's something that in reality is going to play out in a way that's helpful on the ground.
So I was thinking about MDO and coupling and synchronization recently, and I went back and read some older stuff pre 2000. And there seemed to be a really rich scene there that talked about unity of effort, concentration of force, the old principles of war that have a much longer, richer history. And I think in my mind, there was a way that I could interpret synchronization to be those things. It was unity of effort. It was modern parlance for concentration of force. And thinking about synchronization in those ways, I found really helpful. As a broad principle that you could follow, it was great. But there wasn't the slavish adherence to it that feels like happening now because it's become a major buzzword surrounding part of the MDO industry that exists. You sort of get the feeling you've lost that idea of it being a principle and more about it being an enforceable process. Do you think, is it different for you, for your experiences in the US? Is that a distinctly European take on it?
I don't know that I would say that it's a distinctly European take. I don't see it overly differently. I think that might be an output. It could very well be a kind of a spin-off of the larger global context. I mean, we're experiencing and seeing how the world is changing economically around us, and we can see the competition in other non-military spaces around who is going to control or dominate or lead technological production and those elements of economies and so forth. And I think what we're describing here and what we're talking about here is related to that larger trend. And so thinking about the context military is operating in, whether it's in the UK or whether it's in the United States, I think is important. In that context, I think starts to inform what we're feeling perhaps from a top down perspective, and this hunger and this thirst for technology and the absorption of technology at ever greater rates. In my mind, that's tied to industry, that's tied to productive capacity, that's tied to a variety of other non military things that the military and really societies, whether it's European or American, are being asked to introduce and absorb technology at ever greater rates. And I think some of what we're talking about here is tied to that sort of larger context and demand signal.
But I also get on the back of that it goes back to our conversation earlier, right? This need to try and synchronize what we know and understand about warfare, three big domains, what we've always had about warfare, sort of underlying it, information stuff going on, the intelligence, the interpretation, the enemy's intent, all that good stuff that's going on, to do it with new stuff, cyber, bit of space, because space has been there for a lot longer than people are talking about, right? But cyber in particular, this virtual world, and certainly an uncrewed world where we're looking at autonomy, probably requires a structure around it. So somehow we can harness our thinking in different ways. For me, that argument is absolutely valid. What I don't think is if we're couching that just in terms of synchronization, we're possibly going to get the firmest understanding of how to exploit, employ, delegate, and use these capabilities appropriately. And one of those problems in cyber is classification. So in the UK, if you want to try and integrate cyber to it, what level is it done? Who's cleared for the level of access and secrecy with which offensive cyber operations are planned? How do you put that in place? I mean, all these things lend themselves towards the elevating of command and control measures at higher levels. And I'm not averse to that, right? So directive command is required in some circumstances. Detailed command is sometimes required in certain circumstances. Complete delegation is not appropriate for every single circumstance you find yourself in. So I get that. I don't think there is the flexibility in C2 thinking that allows us to do that in these days, because I think mission command has become not just a philosophy, it's become an ideology, and anything but mission command is seen as almost evil, right? I mean, it's something that is executed by authoritarian regimes, despite those authoritarian regimes probably doing mission command better than some of our own forces. You look at the IRGCN or the IRGC, you look at how Iran uses its proxies to do things. There is a lot about mission command that has soaked through into a lot of proxy forces around the world, and they execute it in a different way. Listen, I've stumbled a long way from my question. I guess the point for me was, do we think that the West has the intellectual maturity to rethink C2 and allow something that distinctly isn't mission command in the right circumstances?
The short answer is I think we do. And I think that's the space we're in now, is where we're learning and we're trying to make sense of how we absorb technology, but then at the same time, how we apply it and allow it to be done in a way that enables our service members and our operations at different echelons of command. So I think we can. I think we do. And I'm hanging on your point about the MDO idea maybe being a little bit more rigid than is healthy. There's a variety of different things out there that inevitably prompt cottage industries and real strong advocates. I can see where that really sways things in the space that we're in right now. But I think a mature and measured approach over time really is appropriate, advocates and all. Because if we're doing this in a deliberate way and we're introducing technology, we're learning from technology, we're allowing Marines, sailors, soldiers, airmen, Coast Guardsmen, and the like to operate with technology, human on the loop, if you will, at critical junctures. I think that learning is happening now, and I think that sense making is happening in real time. But to be aware of the pros and cons and taking a measured approach, I think that's just kind of what we do organizationally over time. Can it happen fast enough? No.
Now, I just wanted to come back to you on one point, because you threw in there the human on the loop. And previously, I've had lots of discussions about this idea of on the loop instead of in the loop. It's on the loop, sort of observing. There's more and more people talking openly, particularly in industry now, about a human off the loop, disconnected, about delegating to machines a certain amount of decision-making freedom. That doesn't sit easily with me in terms of the creativity and initiative that we know humans bring to this in particular. Do you think that that idea of humans handing over more and more control to virtual entities, do you think that's preordained to happen just because the speed of battlefield is such that, hypersonics mean that you can't have a human having any delay in there whatsoever? You've got to just hand it over. Are there certain areas where we are just going to hand over entirely to machines?
I think there are places where that can happen. I think there are other places where that's inappropriate. I think a lot of that has to do with the American or the Western culture and our value systems. I think we start getting into that space pretty quickly. For instance, are we going to delegate to drones the ability to apply lethal force? I don't know that that's the right answer, but are we going to delegate to other autonomous systems the ability to move around the battle space? Maybe there's a place for that. But again, this just goes back to human machine teaming and what are the right junctures to where the machine identifies an anomaly and then the human is applied to that to make sense of and apply a judgment. I think both of those ideas can live in the same place. I think you can have things delegated to machines and then at critical junctures where humans make decisions. But I think a lot of that is going to go to societal risk acceptance and value systems and so forth. Where I think that starts to get interesting, really interesting, is when you start to apply what we do with our value system, if you will, versus what a potential adversary may do with their value systems and the differences therein. That starts to get at asymmetries that could be pretty profound in the battle space.
Right. And even more so because these aren't just military values that we in place in our automated systems, right? They're the coder's value as well. So we can't simply represent or think about an adversary AI and decision-making system in the same way we think about our own, because their coders have embedded some things from their culture, some beliefs, some values, some decision-making rationality that is completely foreign to us. And so if we think about those systems as purely Western, the way that we would develop them, we're going to come up with a completely different set of characteristics. So how they interact, that dynamism that you talk about, is going to be absolutely core to the future fight, right? Our understanding of that becomes really important.
I agree with the importance of that. And I think it's also really important to really emphasize the enemy gets a vote. And so the purpose of what we're trying to do, the purpose of whatever our actions are, need to be informed by what our adversary's capabilities are. And so, I was taught early on, never wish away a capability of an adversary. Well, the truth is that in different domains and dimensions, our adversary has the ability to apply an asymmetry, if you will, whether it's in values or whether it's just polluting an information stream that sends the algorithm in a direction that we never intended. That ability exists today. And so, how we observe those instances where that may take place, infiltration or otherwise, I think is a big question mark. But we can't wish away a demonstrated capability of an adversary or become internally focused on our own value systems and the internal discussion there. I think it has to be a fully informed discussion. And so that takes us into a lot of different places that are uncomfortable, but they're essential to us navigating our way through this idea of human on the loop, the decisions that are informing the algorithms, the information space, and all the different inputs that our exquisite technology has the ability to ingest.
Sean, listen, thanks for making time to come on the show. We started talking about coupling. We seem to have elevated the discussion to dizzying new heights. But I think it is a debate that's really important. I think you do too. Those in the profession of arms are all too often simply expected to adhere to the latest doctrine being passed down with an opportunity to understand and challenge the theory and realities on which it can be based. Policy needs to be set in context, right? And theories need unpicking if they're to stand up not to academic debate, but to the realities of combat, the cauldron in which they're going to be tested. Sean, your intervention in this discussion has been really important. Thank you very much. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
Systematic. Join your partners and allies already using our cutting-edge C4 ISR sit-aware suite.
We hope you enjoyed the show. As well as telling your friends and colleagues about it, please do subscribe and leave us a review on any of your usual podcast streaming platforms. These really help us to reach new audiences and spread the word. This episode is produced by AureliusThinking.com as a show for the Wavell Room, the home of intellectual curiosity and challenging thinking for military professionals everywhere. Thanks for listening.